been a long time since we did Considering Charlotte. Of course, I've had a lot more time in the Global Methodist Church. I've stepped away from the United Methodist Church, been away for a while. Haven't really done a good job staying abreast of what's going on, but still a lot of people I care about in the United Methodist Church. A lot of people I respect, and I'm spending about an hour now with a couple of those people. Odell Horn and Lonnie Brooks have been a wellspring of information and wisdom. As once upon a time I was on the inside and trying to help figure out what was going on, and now it's still confusing, and I think a lot of people could still bear to get a good picture of what's going on in the United Methodist Church. It's still a multi-million-dollar organization with millions of members around the world. And what's the point of building up a platform if you can't use it to spread good information? So hopefully that's what this hour is going to be. I'm just going to be checking in with Lonnie and Odell. Simon and Joe couldn't be with us this time, but we've already scheduled another time a couple weeks out, so we might be able to get the whole crew together. We'll see. But for today, if you all don't know him, this is Lonnie Brooks here, and this is Odell Horn. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. How we doing?
Well, thanks.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've caught up a little bit personally, and life has been moving for all of us, but we're going to cover some good business today. Lonnie's been writing some on recent developments in the Judicial Council of the United Methodist Church. A recent decision was made that Global Methodists couldn't help but notice, which was pretty much saying that even though some specific language was adopted by the General Conference last year, actually local churches are not going to get to control whether or not they facilitate and host gay weddings or anything else. That's up to entirely the conscience of the clergy on site, and who cares what the local church wants. I might have mischaracterized that a little bit, but I just know that there's a lot of feelings of broken promises and words having meant very little. I don't know if that's what you at all were planning on talking about today or not, but Lonnie, we wanted to defer to you first and see kind of what you've been noticing and concerns you have and any hopes that you have. What is it that people, in particular, let's make this an insider conversation. Who cares about people outside of the UMC? But people inside of the UMC, what should they be noting about the current conduct of the Judicial Council and any implications this has for the future?
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thanks, Odell, as well. And I'm really pleased to be part of this gathering today.
Yeah.
There are several things that are of concern, I think, rightfully so, to United Methodists out of the action taken by the Judicial Council recently. And this goes back all the way to the previous session in October. The decision 1512, in which the council said that the paragraph of the Book of Discipline that's in the discipline primarily for the purpose of describing how churches are closed or discontinued, as the old language was. And specifically, the Judicial Council ruled that that paragraph cannot be used as a way of allowing a local church, gracefully to exit from the denomination. The position of the Judicial Council is that the paragraph that was put in the 2019 General Conference to enable gracious exit, paragraph 2553, expired as it was originally intended to do. And that, in the thinking and rationale of the Judicial Council, meant that any possibility of a gracious exit therefore expired with that law. The flaw in that thinking, in my judgment, is that gracious exit was a process that was available long before the legislation was adopted by General Conference 2019. The gracious exit did not begin with the enaction of paragraph 2553. And therefore, in my judgment, there's no rational way in which you can hold that it was therefore eliminated with the expiration of a paragraph that had its own expiration date within its text. But nevertheless, that's what the Judicial Council ruled. And it did
Clarifying
that
question, real quick, Lonnie.
Go ahead.
Because as I recall, there was a provision in the Book of Discipline prior to 2553, 2548.2, which allowed for a transfer to another evangelical denomination, which was utilized by annual conferences before disaffiliation season. But a previous action of the Judicial Council ruled that that part of the Book of Discipline was now null and void because 2553 existed. So as I recall the rationale, it was only one provision for disaffiliation can exist. Therefore, the new one cancels out the old one. But once 2553 expired, 2548.2 did not come back into existence. Instead, there was now no provision. And as I recall, you've made the argument, well, even if there isn't any provision, annual conferences can still negotiate individually with churches as they see fit. There's just no disciplinary explicit language for it. So there can still be disaffiliation, but it sounds to me as though the Judicial Council is actually saying, no, there can't be. So where am I confused in connecting all those dots?
I don't think you're confused. It's just a really complex situation, Jeffrey, and there's little clarity, and the Judicial Council, in their various rulings, haven't brought very much clarity to that process, except in their thinking. I'm sure they think that what they've said in Decision 1512 back in October, which is there is no process now for gracious exit. They think that clarifies it. Well, I don't think it does. The need for disaffiliations will go on. It existed prior to 2553. For that matter, it existed prior to any concern over human sexuality as a motivating factor. There are just various reasons, and have always been various reasons for churches to want to split off. And I don't think that a church is ultimately going to have the power, the church in the broader sense, the United Methodist Church specifically, is going to be able to stop that just by judicial fiat. They can't do it legislatively, can't do it judicially. The churches will find a way to separate. And the issue will boil down to whether we want those ongoing disaffiliations to be filled with rancor and ill will, or do we want to do it in a way that flows from Christian love and good relationships and amicability? Those are the choices, really. And the Judicial Council seems to favor the way of rancor and conflict.
Do you think that they would agree with your characterization of it's going to happen? It's always happened. It's always going to happen. The way what I just heard you say, I'm pretty sure I heard you right, is it's always going to happen. There's nothing you can do to turn the spigot off, but right now we can just determine if it's going to be on amicable terms or adversarial terms, and the only thing that they've done is make it automatically adversarial. Do you think the Judicial Council sees it that way, or do you think that there's something that or maybe do they have the hubris to think that they actually can turn the spigot off?
I believe that they think they've turned the spigot off. Yeah, and that's quite naive. It is not going to be effective. Churches will continue to leave, and they'll find various ways to do it. Now, mind you, I believe that the way continues to exist, and I say that because of where the power lies in the process, and in its most recent decision, this hinged on action in one conference following the tendering in October of Decision 1512, saying this process is over, we're done with it, now there won't be any more disaffiliations. Following that decision, I immediately issued an opinion piece on my Facebook page saying that this it is not over, and we're going to find ourselves in a conflict of power between the various bodies of the church. Well, it wasn't. It was only hours, days, just a day or two at the most, when the Dakota's annual conference said, "Oh, wow! By the way, we've just called a special session of the conference to consider a recommendation for the Board of Trustees of the conference to allow Embrace United Methodist Church to use paragraph 2549 to graciously exit with its property in recognition of a $1.25 million exit fee that they're willing to pay the church to leave with their property. I mean, so I didn't know that I would be quite that prophetic, but in any case, the conference then decided to go forward with that special session, and the conference overwhelmingly supported the recommendation of the Board of Trustees and adopted the negotiated settlement, and Embrace Church did come into reality with the discontinuance, the closure of Embrace United Methodist Church. And they paid the fee, $1.25 million, and took the property with them. And I'm sure that's settled now in secular judicial processes, and is a fait accompli, a done deal. And the fact is that when the Judicial Council considered the bishop's ruling that this was in response, the bishop ruled in response to a question of law from one of the members of the conference, that this was legal, that the conference had followed, and the board had followed all the required provisions of the Book of Discipline that were in place, and made the deal. And the Judicial Council found what they called flaw in the process. They claimed, the Judicial Council claimed that they had not done their due diligence in determining whether or not the congregation was viable. Whether it was never in question, but the congregation was viable in my judgment. That was part of their process. They showed it was a vital congregation, ongoing. So that wasn't even an issue. But in any case, the Judicial Council, at the end of all this, the statement of its rationale and the ruling, said, however, we're only ruling on the legality of the resolution and its adoption, not on the outcome. Well, that kind of de facto, in my judgment, makes it a moot question. I'm not even sure why the Judicial Council would break its own rule against deciding moot issues, because it had, the Judicial Council was demonstrating its real impotence here. It had no authority to stop the conference's consideration of the board's recommendation for closure, or its recommendation that the property then be sold for the $1.25 million to the new Embrace Church that was formed out of the ashes of Embrace United Methodist Church. It had no authority to change the fact of closure, and it had no authority to discipline either the bishop or anybody else in the conference or the conference itself for going forward. So all the action that was taken by the annual conference and its board of trustees, uh, and to transfer the property under laws of the state, uh, stand exactly as they were before the Judicial Council took up this action and made its decision. So it was from any practical point of view, it was a non-decision. Just said, in fact, in my judgment, effectively what they said, well, yeah, you've done this, but we don't like it.
So, as I recall, I remember reading about this Embrace Church a while back. They were closed under the paragraph 2549, which is for exigent circumstances that are met whenever viability was in question or it becomes clear that the church no longer serves the purpose for which it was first designated. One of those provisions is if there's been theological drift, so they were able to substantiate that actually doctrinally this body has drifted. And the one example I remember being in its sacramental theology, they were no longer willing to baptize babies. And so for that reason and a couple others, they made the case that it was no longer really a United Methodist Church doctrinally, and that's why paragraph 2549 was appropriate. Did the Judicial
Absolutely
Council...
true, and all amicable. There, I mean, nobody was being accusatory in this process, as far as I can tell. Mind you, that I've had some insight into this because two of our clergy in Alaska Conference are actually members of the Dakota's annual conference. In fact, they both are at my local church, so I did have some insight. And the brief that we submitted was submitted by all three of us. Those two, Fergus and I, submitted our brief on this issue. That was in full support of the bishop and the conference's action. So I have to disclose that as kind of my personal contact here.
Right.
But in any case, yeah, it was a totally amicable process. As if we're called to be anything as Christians, in respect to our relationship with our brothers and sisters in the faith, it's amicable, for goodness sake.
Mm-hmm. Well, but so in the Judicial Council response, you've made clear they said it shouldn't have gone through, and yet there's nothing we can do about it, which goes against...
That's what they've done, yes.
So did they answer at all whether or not the stipulations of 2549 had indeed been substantiated by doctrinal drift?
No, they didn't address that.
Of course. Okay, yeah. Well, so I'm just getting not PTSD. This is all sounding very familiar to me from chapters beforehand where there's clear ecclesiastical law that is being violated, although I would say this is not as clear. But, when you're going, you, Lonnie, are saying, well, they're ruling on this issue. They don't have any authority to do anything, so this is just an exercise in pointlessness. I mean, that's my words now in summarizing what you've said. But when we already had several chapters of people disobeying the book of discipline before out of conscience or whatever, it doesn't really matter what the motivation is. And there has been no repercussion for bishops who violate the book of discipline. I'm making, in case I'm not being clear enough, rules around sexual morality that were in place for a long time. Whenever you've been flouting those rules and church laws for some time, then it makes sense to me that the United Methodist Church would find itself now where all the rules are getting flouted and the Judicial Council doesn't really have a leg to stand on in bringing any church discipline down. And so am I right to conclude that this is now a situation where every annual conference can kind of do whatever is right in its own eyes and there will be no repercussions?
I believe that is, broadly speaking, the reality in which we're existing right now in our church, that we do have this conflict of powers within the church. The Judicial Council actually has kind of set it up the way they've interpreted the trust clause as a constitutional crisis. I think that's a false representation because I think the Judicial Council is on extremely weak ground in having elevated the trust clause, and I've quoted in my postings the language that the Judicial Council used in raising the trust clause to the constitutional status. They've clearly done that, and they did that by intent, which is really, really weak reasoning, because the trust clause is not part of the Constitution. It never has been part of the Constitution. It's always been a legislative act of the General Conference. It's been amended many times by the General Conference without any ratification, clearly indicating that it's not constitutional. And so we can't say we're in a constitutional crisis, in my judgment, because it's not, we're not dealing with a constitutional issue here. On the other hand, it is a clear conflict between the powers. I believe that annual conferences will continue to be called on to do some kind of action that's going to amount to an amicable separation with one or more of its local churches. And in my judgment, they have the power to do that. And the Judicial Council doesn't have the power to stop it. It doesn't have the power to change it. And it doesn't have the power to punish anyone who's involved in that process. So will conferences do that? In my judgment, they probably will, yeah.
Odell, what say you? Any thoughts or provocations for Lonnie here?
This is very, very interesting in that when you read the 2020-2024 Book of Discipline, it is very, very supportive of the clergy, supportive of the general agencies, but of the local church, the decisions that are made at the local church level. The Book of Discipline it really does put the power in the episcopacy and the general agencies of the United Methodist Church, and it sort of leaves the local church out in terms of the decision-making process in the United Methodist Church. That's just my opinion. And so I would really like to hear, similar to what Lonnie just said, or the action that has been taken in the Mississippi Annual Conference and the response by the Southeastern College of Bishops.
Are you asking me to comment on that,
Yeah.
Odell? Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, you know, the power that rests with the local church comes from, in my judgment, the reality that the local church is really the basic body of the church. Now, mind you, in law, we declare that the basic body of the church is the annual conference. And mind you, that right away, you know, it's not the Judicial Council. Even in our law, we say it's the annual conference, right? However, we also go on and say that the mission of the church is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And we go on in that same section of the discipline there to say the primary place, I'm paraphrasing, but what we say essentially is the primary place where we make disciples is in the local church. We don't make disciples in annual conferences. The best thing we can do in annual conferences, and the discipline says this too, is we can empower local churches in their process of making disciples, because that's where it happens. Well, if you say your mission is to make disciples, and you say the primary place where we do that is in the local church, well, it says to me that you've just acknowledged that the basic body of the church is the local church, because that's where you do your mission.
Either that, or the primary purpose of the United Methodist Church is not actually to make disciples, but it's to
you have to conclude one thing or the other. If your mission is to make disciples, and you do that in the local churches, that's where your basic body is. Okay, so that's really the power seat of the local church, is that it's the disciple-making body of the church. Now, mind you, how effectively the local church can exercise that power in the decision-making processes of the connection is a different thing. And that depends on size and money. That's the raw fact of life. So our really, really big churches can control much of the process, for example, of deployment of the clergy. And when that reality gets interrupted, you have stuff like happened in your conference, Odell, in North Georgia with Mount Bethel. That's a really big deal when that happens, when you disrupt the authority of these really big local churches to pick their clergy.
Well, but also, as I
It's a
recall,
big conflict, and it isn't real clear who's going to win in those kinds of conflicts. And in this case, Mount Bethel eventually won that.
Well, and
it cost a lot of money, but they did it.
I was inclined to bring it up in the context of Embrace Church, that, as I recall, they had a massive amount of debt. And so whenever you're looking at why would the Dakotas be willing to let go of this huge church whenever, Mount Bethel gets held back in another, does the amount of debt that a church carries have something to do with it when you have a congregation who's willing to walk away? So we were talking before we even hit record today, how much does the almighty dollar play a role in a lot of these decisions domestically and abroad? And this could easily just be one more occasion of it really is just about money and a lot of it depends on how cynical you want to be. But it's hard to say, it's hard to look at any other governing principle that's consistently upheld as consistently as concern for the dollar. Yeah,
well put, cynically, but truthfully, in my judgment.
Odell, I know that you had other concerns today that also intersect with these themes we've already established today. I know some of it had to do with the new regional conferences being established, but I don't think it was just limited to that. So what direction do you want to take us today?
I do, but I want to ask Lonnie one more question, and that is, at the general conference, we voted, there were 10 petitions that were authored about the voting rights of local pastors at annual conferences. And all 10 of them were defeated, even though there was a valiant effort by Terry Walton and Beth LaRocca Pitts and myself of the North Georgia Conference to bring one of these petitions to the floor for a debate. How much are our local churches, churches with local pastors, I should say, how much are those churches absent from the decision-making process in the annual conference and thus feel they are not empowered in the United Methodist Church? And from what I can tell, that looks like a lot of the churches that disaffiliated in the last quadrennium.
Yeah, that's a really big problem. And we need to get some resolution to that. And the only resolution that's going to be effective, and the only real resolution, will be empowerment of these local pastors. And I've been an advocate of that for a really long time, and as ineffective as anybody else has been who's been trying to get that moved forward. There's an entrenched resistance. It's strictly power-based of the ordained clergy to empowerment of clergy who are not ordained in these decision processes. And specifically, they don't get to vote on constitutional amendments, and they don't get to vote on, they actually, some do now get to vote on who general conference delegates are, but they don't get to serve as general conference delegates. And these are really big issues. And just the matter of not being able to serve as delegates to general conference is a huge disempowerment of that whole block of people. That needs to be fixed.
All right, Odell, carry us forward.
Thank you, Lonnie, because it is of my opinion that a lot of our churches have local pastors. But I want to talk about the regional conferences, because as we are coming up on the ratification vote at annual conferences on the regional conferences, and still the judicial conferences, jurisdictional conferences still exist. And there's been no mention in writing by mainstream UMC or any of the UMC bishops to get rid of the jurisdictional conferences. It appears to me, and I'd be interested in Lonnie in hearing what you would have to say on this, that the jurisdictional conferences in the last quadrennium were weaponized against the churches that were disaffiliating. And now that those churches have disaffiliated, there is no intent to get rid of the jurisdictional conferences, which were born during the legacy of segregation in this United Methodist, and what is now the United Methodist Church. And we are just going to add another level of governance if regionalization passes to the United States that does not exist anywhere else in the world. Lonnie, I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, you've keyed on probably what I think to be the primary failing of the current proposal for regionalization. I have to put that in the context of saying that I support the idea of regionalization of the church. I just believe that the current proposal to do that is significantly, in fact, seriously, in my judgment, fatally flawed. And one of the key reasons for that situation is the fact that it doesn't do away with the jurisdictions. They're the legacy of racism, and primarily, I'm going to say Southern racism, because it was because of the resistance of the Southeast, what became the Southeastern jurisdiction, which was the old Methodist Episcopal Church South, enshrined in a jurisdiction, Southeastern jurisdiction, that insisted on the jurisdictional system to make sure that no Black person was ever going to be a bishop of the white churches of the South. That's why we have the jurisdictional system to start with. And
so the temptation that I've had ever since we've been having these conversations is to say they're all racist, it's all structural racism, because the people that I disagree with, I know that hurts them, and part of me enjoys jabbing at them. But I've at some points I felt like that's a disingenuous thing for me to say, because I really do think it all fits on this paradigm of progressive versus conservative. Looking at the previous issue we were just discussing, the local licensed pastors and how much power they're given, they also happen to be much more conservative than ordained clergy who are elders. It feels to me that even though some of this stuff was rooted in a prior structure that had racialist concerns, now it really is just ideological. So the regionalization plan was put in place in order to benefit disproportionately progressives. The apportionment of bishops was put through to benefit disproportionately progressives, and then the limitations on local licensed pastors, once again, legislative effort at prioritizing and privileging the progressive position. How much do you think that, I guess today a concern is making things too simplistic, but to me it really does feel like this is about progressivism and money, and if you look through those two lenses, you understand everything that's going on right now. And the racialist stuff, even though it fits pretty squarely, is actually not as good a lens through all this stuff. It looks quite embarrassing whenever you apply the racialist lens to it. So, Odell, let me see what your initial response to that are, and then Lonnie, you can add what texture you want, of course.
I would agree with you, but I feel that there's an anti-African sentiment in the United Methodist Church, and that anti-African sentiment is coming from liberals and progressives. They don't want the Africans who have the numbers to take over the United Methodist Church. They don't want to take them over. They don't want the Africans to take over the United Methodist Church, and regionalization is a way to prevent Africans from taking over the United Methodist Church. There are no Africans who are the heads of any of the 13 boards or agencies of the United Methodist Church. It just is, the easiest way that I can say it is that the General Commission on Religion and Race brought in Robin DiAngelo to talk about her book, Nice Racism, how white progressive people perpetuate racial harm. And I think that if regionalization passes, this is further perpetuating racial harm by white progressive people, because let's be honest, not only are there no Africans in charge of the boards and agencies within the United Methodist Church, we just have to look at how even Black Methodists for Church Renewal did not have a good relationship with Africa Initiative. I find it peculiar, and I call this out in one of my articles, how Black Methodists for Church Renewal did not ask for the abolishment of the jurisdictional conferences. And they supported the United Methodist Africa Forum, which is an upstart from after the special session of the General Conference. They had no diplomatic relationship with Africa Initiative at all. So
the way that I explained that was so much of the African American experience has been married to the Democrat Party for so long. So much of this maps onto political loyalties. And as you come up against these different challenges in the UMC, and you're looking at it through the lens of progressivism versus, these racist Trump conservatives, then African Americans have to discern, okay, who's on the side of the conservative racists? And so they look at other people with the same ethnic features, but they live somewhere else, and they go, well, these people are being hoodwinked by these racists in America, so we're not going to stand with them. We're going to be with the Africa Initiative that's underwritten by the Africa UMAF. I forget what they were, but they're clearly supported by progressive dollars, progressive white liberal dollars, but that fits with the Democrat Party agenda and the longstanding loyalties that African Americans have, and we're going to stand by our loyalties here. And to people like me, that just seemed crazy, but this is what party politics does. This is what happens when you ride the brand, is they have no compunction about using you in order to get what they want while giving you nothing. And so that's how I've read your piece, just calling out African Americans, just going, guys, how much do they have to hurt you before you realize they're not with you? That's my interpretive work that I've done. I don't think you've spoken quite that plainly, but do you feel like, well, I guess I think a person who's reading you earnestly would come away with Odell Horn thinks that African Americans should have thrown their lot in with the majority of Africans, and that so you're nodding your head. Would that be for racialist reasons, or would that be because ideologically you really do fit better together and have much more consonants? Okay, it's the latter. Okay, talk on that a little bit more, and then we'll let Lonnie talk some.
Yeah, it is my clear opinion that Black Methodists for Church Renewal should have, when the Africans first became Africa Initiative first formed in 2008, it is Black Methodists for Church Renewal who should have been partnering with Africa Initiative from its onset. And I have no idea as to why this did not happen historically, but it was the good news that filled that void in the partnership with Africa. Yeah. Now, your analysis is absolutely correct until they ran up with somebody who has a master's degree in African and African American studies from a historically Black university and could bring in the sources on African life and culture before slavery and colonialism, and could show you, based upon Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s research, how African societies were built around polygamy, how there was a mandate charter dating back to 1236 for one of the, I believe it was the Mali Empire. That was a written charter on how you would order your life living in this empire, when some people have always said, no, there was no written history of Africa. It was only oral traditions that were passed down from generations through the griots. Well, we know that's partially true, but that's not the whole truth. And so now African Americans have run into somebody who's degreed and credentialed in the field, who can pull the sources And now you have a problem because you have aligned yourselves with people who are, now that the evangelicals are gone, are using some of the same tactics against Black churches that Black churches accuse the evangelicals of doing. And so now you got a problem because the racism still exists in this denomination and the evangelicals are gone. So I'm just trying to educate folk that Africa had a history prior to slavery and colonialism. And there have always been traditional African societies. There is no such thing as a liberal African society or progressive African society. That's a Eurocentric social construct that you're reading onto people. So blaming the Africans for how they voted at the special session of the General Conference that they were paid off by the evangelicals is an uninformed position.
Oh, yeah. Odell, your observation that regionalization is disempowering, specifically to Africa, is really, really insightful. And the irony of that is that regionalization is couched and presented by its supporters as a matter of empowering the central conferences, and it does quite the opposite, in my judgment, specifically with respect to Africa. One of the principal things that the supporters promote about regionalization is that it will allow the central conferences to have more of a voice in their own affairs. Well, the fact is that the one real empowering act in the regionalization is to create a regional conference for all of the United States that will be over the jurisdiction. So, and the reason touted is because the United States Church needs to have a place to express its voice over United States interests. Well, come on, give me a break, because Africa now has, arguably one where the numbers keep dancing around, so we don't know for sure. But in the near future, if not now, Africa is going to have more United Methodists than the United States. And we are not providing any Pan-African equivalent to this regional conference for the United States, where there will be one place for Africa to express its voice. And that's supposed to be empowering?
Well, wait, it was my understanding, I remember we had Lloyd Nierota on, who was one of the authors of the regionalization plan that created these regional conferences, and he described his
Christmas
agenda.
Covenant.
Sorry?
Christmas Covenant.
Christmas Covenant. So,
Which is
but I
kind of
remember,
the forerunner, though.
yeah, I remember that being a forerunner to the plan. So I was speaking in shorthand. But as I recall him saying, this did create an Africa-only forum where they can focus on issues just pertaining to them and not have to wade through all of this American business. But what I hear you saying is that hasn't been the product of this legislation.
It's not part of the current proposal. They're kind of side proposals that supposedly explain all this stuff, and that's one of them. But the actual thing that's going to be voted on here at the annual conferences doesn't include any kind of Pan-African forum or place for a voice for all of Africa. No, it doesn't, and it doesn't deal with this jurisdictional conference matter that we have been talking about either. It's just not there. And in fact, when Christina Schneiders made the presentation of the regionalization proposal to the General Conference, she right up front acknowledged that as a problem for this proposal. It's not there. The jurisdictional conferences still exist. They still are the same problem they always were. But her explanation of this is, well, we'll deal with that later. That's another issue for another time. Let's do this one now and do the jurisdictional conference thing later. Well, there ain't any proposal to do that.
Yeah, I remember.
So far, it's just a pipe dream.
mainstream United Methodist speakers getting up and acknowledging that, okay, we do need to dismantle this racialist jurisdictional system. There are problems with this. However, we can't perfect this all before moving forward with regionalization. That's the thing before us right now. We need to go ahead and do that. That's what's incumbent upon us right now. And that argument carried the day. I think that was from my outside perspective watching that. I remember watching that and just going, well, this is too flawed to really take seriously. I mean, you already had significantly reduced African representation at that general conference, although the voting still went in a scandalous direction so far as I was concerned. I've been amazed at how the Methodist institution, United Methodist Institution, has been able to affect African votes to go in the direction of that's beneficial to progressives. I'm happy leaving my words right there. Odell, I'm thinking you have additional words to say about regionalization votes going on in annual conferences around the world right now. Do you have a way of weaving all this together in a way that you think it would be beneficial for the audience?
The only thing that I can say is that if you are in the United States, you are in a jurisdictional conference. You are in a system that was set up during segregation. And as Lonnie has correctly assessed, the Methodist Episcopal Church South wanted and pushed for the jurisdictional system. Well, many of those churches have left, and we still have the jurisdictional system. So now this isn't the conservatives holding up this racist system. It is liberals and progressives in the United Methodist Church who are holding up this racist system. The bishops have not come out in any written statements and said we need to get rid of the jurisdictional system. Mainstream UMC has not come out, and to my knowledge, in any written statement and saying we need to do that first before we do regionalization. So if I'm a Black United Methodist, I'm not voting for your agenda until you deal with what I am requesting, and that is to get rid of the jurisdictional system. We will not vote for regionalization until the racist jurisdictional system that you accused, the Wesleyan Covenant Association and the Global Methodist Church, you used as a weapon against them. And now that they're gone, you're the ones holding it up. We're not voting for regionalization. This system of the jurisdictions needs to go, and it needs to go now. And we need to defeat regionalization to show the Council of Bishops and the United Methodist Church and mainstream UMC that we will not be a party to what you are pushing as lay people in this church until you deal with the racism that's in this church that you are upholding. And so we need to get rid of jurisdictional conferences immediately, and there will be no regional conference until we get rid of the jurisdictions.
So far, a lot of annual conferences have already voted on regionalization. I've been particularly surprised at the votes on the African continent. In order for regionalization to be adopted, because it was a constitutional amendment, 2/3 of all annual conference delegates have to vote in favor of it. If it doesn't clear that threshold, though, they don't get 2/3. What happens? Everything defaults to how it already has been, right? And then what happens then? I don't have clarity about what happens then if regionalization gets shut down.
There were some pieces of the regionalization proposal that were not constitutional amendments, and those would be carried forward, put in place. Although how effective they're going to be without the constitutional piece remains to be seen. I don't think they'll be very effective at all. But if this is the right time for it, Jeffrey, there are some other flaws I'd like to bring out with regionalization.
Let me just say one thing.
Oh, go ahead,
Lonnie. There is a U.S. regional committee that was established at the General Conference, and that went into effect. It is the equivalence to the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters. Correct me if I'm.
You're right, and it doesn't depend on the constitutional amendments.
So we have a system. Regionalization is not a must. We have a system in place right now called the U.S. Regional Committee that is already in effect. And we can hold our vote against regionalization and say, hey, if you want this, get rid of the jurisdictional conferences first because you already have a regional committee.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That makes sense to me. I would love to be optimistic about, for so far as I'm concerned, it's too much to hope that any organization aligns perfectly with what any one person believes. But I think an earnest and honest conversation between good faith actors is desirable and actually achievable. That's something that the United Methodist Church has thus far failed at, but that doesn't mean that it has to continue to fall flat. So, Lonnie, you had some additional texture to add for the regionalization concern?
Yeah, and I should say up front that these are things that we've already talked about, in this forum. But the new context is that the annual conferences are now voting. Before we were concentrating on the action at General Conference. But I think it needs to be said that at least in my judgment, not the only flaw in this regionalization proposal is the issue of it's not discontinuing the jurisdictional conferences. That's a big one. But there are at least three others that I've identified that I think are really important as well. First, the proposal that we have does not regionalize the episcopacy, and that's a big problem because of the power of the episcopacy. If it is not regionalized, then otherwise regionalization will be ineffective because of the power that is concentrated not regionally in the episcopacy, the way it's currently structured. Bishops, there's a specific phrase in the discipline that says that even though they're elected by jurisdictions or central conferences, bishops are bishops of the whole church. And that means that a bishop elected in and serving in California is a bishop of Zimbabwe or Cote d'Ivoire, as long as they're in the church. I don't know, they may be gone already, but take your favorite African country, and those bishops are bishops of those countries as well as they are, even though they don't preside there for the moment, but they are subject to transfer and presiding there. So that is an issue. Another issue, in my judgment, is that this creates a whole new layer of church for the United States at precisely the time that we need to be downsizing the connectional structure of the church, not expanding it, with all the implications of what expansion in this kind of connectional structure means. And the third thing that I would say is that we've got some United Methodist churches in British Columbia, not well recognized throughout much of the church, but it's really a significant concern for those of us in the West. And these churches are currently in limbo. That is to say, there is a geographical component of all our conference systems right now, with the exception perhaps of Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference. Their boundaries are not specific to any geographical area, but all other rest of our conferences are structured regionally, geographically. And these churches that are in British Columbia don't have a home. They're welcomed and they participate in the Pacific Northwest Conference, but they're not part of it because they're not geographically within the current Pacific Northwest Conference. And we can't make them part of the Pacific Northwest Conference until we include British Columbia in that conference. And there's no recognition of that in the current regionalization proposal. So we're leaving these churches in limbo by adopting this regional proposal.
Okay.
When there's a clear way to fix that.
Which would be? What's a clear way to fix that issue with
Make British Columbia part of the Northwest region.
Would that be an action of the General Conference?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm sure there are a lot more issues pertaining to regionalization that we could hit on, but it's been about an hour, and we've already got another session scheduled for a couple weeks out. I would imagine there's a lot more that we can talk about. Maybe I'll get you guys to talk about this Judicial Council decision that I started the hour off with, and we don't have time for today, but with respect to clergy right to marry whoever they want in the building. Maybe we can come back around to that. Maybe we can come back around to the love train that the United Methodist Church is on, and this bishop's party that they're hosting instead of this general conference that was originally slated for next year. Who knows what else is on the plate? I'll defer to you guys, and maybe we'll rope a couple others in. Any closing notes before we say goodbye? All right.
I would like to say that if you are, in all seriousness, if you are at a church with a local pastor, your local pastor doesn't have voting rights on constitutional amendments, I would vote no to regionalization. If you are at a Black church and you are in the United States and this jurisdictional system is still, I would vote no. Like, we need to send the United Methodist Church a message that you just can't put things on consent calendars and pass them and then expect annual conferences to vote for what you're pushing.
I would add to that I really like those dreams and hopes that you've expressed there, Odell. But I would also add that if you're a fiscal conservative and you don't like to see us spend money at the connectional level when the local churches are in decline throughout the United States, then you ought to vote no also.
Good thoughts. All right. Well, there's a lot more to be said, and we'll be saying it soon. Thanks to Lonnie and Odell for adding so much good thought to my brain in this hour, and hope it's been a blessing to those of you who joined us. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to PlainSpoken, where I post this and other great content. I'm happy to steal other people's great minds and pass it off as my own. So thanks for being complicit in that, guys, and we'll be seeing everybody next time.
Thanks.